SPJIMR's Center for Wisdom and Leadership presents its podcast series, Sapience. It is about the practical aspects of a wisdom-based approach on leadership, various global and societal issues.
Hello, welcome to Sapience, a special podcast series brought to you by SPJIMR's Center for Wisdom in Leadership. I am Surya Tahora, Executive Director of CWIL, and today for the third episode, I will be in conversation with Dr. David Rooney. David Rooney is Honorary Professor of Management and Organizational Studies at Macquarie Business School, Macquarie University in Sydney. He has researched, taught, and published widely in the area of wisdom, leadership, knowledge-based economy, and creative industry.
So welcome, David, to this podcast series. It's really a pleasure to have you for various reasons. One is that we have been, in touch for a few years now. And the second is that I have to say here that how much you have initiated the idea of this center here in Bombay, in India, and also have been supporting and continuing to support all our activities. So thanks a lot again.
Well, thank you, and it's great to be on the podcast. I've been looking forward to this for a while.
So related to this aspect that you're mentioning about ideas, and more specifically, history of ideas. How ideas are evolving and how some of the ideas manifest in the society and become pregnant and become, inhabited by people and groups and societies and so on. So can we look at wisdom research from this angle and maybe ask ourselves, what does this history of ideas matter in wisdom and particularly in research?
So the short answer is yes, we do have to. It's really important that we do. But a longer answer is that we really have. Let's just, for argument's sake, say we've got 3,000 years worth of literature on wisdom. And particularly we can say definitely 3,000 years in India, and we can say pretty close to that at least in the European tradition as well. So there's a lot of stuff out there, and a lot of the greatest minds that have ever walked on the planet have put their mind to questions about, well, what is wisdom and how do you develop it? So to save us contemporary researchers from just wandering around reinventing the wheel and possibly even doing a really bad job of that, why don't we just take advantage of the work that's already there? Now, one reason why we don't is because, well, a lot of people have not studied philosophy or history, for example. And so we used to call the history of ideas the history of philosophy, and then sometimes people called it intellectual history, but I prefer the more down-to-earth idea of the history of ideas, because they are ideas, and ideas are things that you can work with, and ideas are very practical, and anyone can have ideas. And so not all people who have had good ideas about wisdom have been professionally trained philosophers. So it's saving us from reinventing wheels badly, I think is a good thing to do. But also there's a growing awareness in the humanities that there are some pretty big gaps in general terms what the mainstream of academia actually knows about ancient ideas. And we know very little really about the whole of Asia, and we're going to focus particularly on India and there's countries like Tibet and Bhutan and Nepal and places like that up in the high mountains, and then we know almost nothing of South America,
Absolutely. Yeah.
And we know very little about African intellectual or history of ideas, except that from right across the northern Islamic part of Africa. And then apart from that, the only other kind of tradition that we typically call on is the North American tradition. So it's not very broad, and so it's sort of become an important mission, and through the centre, as we were just saying, that we find a conduit to help this intellectual history from India in particular get out there and get it to cross-pollinate with a lot of the work that we're doing globally in particularly in psychology, but also in business schools, and some people like Dilip Jester, doing it in neuroscientific research. So, I do think it's important, and I think it's also important because the ancients, they didn't see philosophical inquiry as purely academic, purely theoretical. They saw it as very practical, and I'm very interested in practical things, and one of the things we've struggled with, I think, in contemporary wisdom research is to figure out how to put it in practical packages that we can use, say, for leadership development.
Absolutely.
So I do think it's very important. And
so, David, can I? Sorry, if you allow me.
No, go ahead.
So it seems that let's say this Indian subcontinent or Indian, let's say, geographically as a source of one of the tradition of the world seems to be important to you. So, but can I ask you, why is it so, and what place it has acquired now for you as a researcher? And maybe as a prof also, and I know you're doing also some intervention in also, as you say, on the ground with the army people and so on. So, can you tell us about what is the place that India has in this vast constellation, and what are the benefits, or what would be something unique that this Indian or Vedic tradition, for example, if we take one, would bring? And how it could enrich our looking at wisdom as a construct.
Yeah. So, well, I started pursuing wisdom with Aristotle, and Aristotle remains really important to me because he wrote about what we now, in what translates into English as practical wisdom. And so the idea was that you could have conceptual or cognitive wisdom. You could be a wise thinker. But what was the point of that if all you could do was think wisely? And so Aristotle said, well, you have to go a step further than that, and you have to actually have a wise impact on your society. So I thought that was really interesting. And but then at around about the same time, or maybe a bit earlier, actually, I became interested in mindfulness. And so I've had a mindfulness practice for 25 years now, or almost 25 years now. So that led me to look at Buddhism, which I've looked at very, very closely, and I'm at least as much influenced by that as I am with Aristotle, but probably these days I'm more influenced by the Buddhist perspective, not just on mindfulness, but on, I guess, a Buddhist psychology, really, and Buddhist ethics. And actually, Buddhist ethics are pretty much the same as Aristotle's virtue ethics, or character ethics, as some people call it. So, but here's the important thing, or one of the important things. So one important thing is that ancient Greek tradition practical philosophy and practical wisdom got turned into an ivory tower academic theoretical pursuit, and it lost its links to being a member of a wise community and being an individual in that community that sought to live wisely. And I think India and other Asian countries have, and particularly in Buddhism, in my experience, but probably in other Vedic traditions as well, have managed to keep a closer relationship with that practical side of wisdom. That it's a practical way of living excellently in society, in your community, with all the problems and all the lack of resources and problems with abuse of political power and all of that sort of stuff. But you can still act wisely as a citizen. So there is that. And one of the things that I've said several times in speaking gigs in India is that I think India is the net largest exporter of wisdom in world history, and I can't quantify that, and I have no idea how I could quantify that. But
how we could do that?
It's pretty true. I mean, if you look at how yoga has taken off across the world, like it's absolutely everywhere, and it's a practical wisdom tradition.
How is it, David? Can I ask you how yoga, because in layman understanding, and I guess how many people are practicing it, it just is a set of, let's say, physical and maybe some breathing exercise, physiological. But what is the connection between wisdom and this set of practices that yoga seem to be inhabited with? Yeah.
Well, I mean, the core of yoga is weaving together mind and body, and to be practically wise in Aristotle's sense, you have to actually be able to integrate what's wise in your mind, what wise thoughts and judgments you make in your mind, with how you act in society. And how you act in society is with your body. It could be your voice, could be your legs, it could be the way you tilt your head, but it's what you actually do. So it's also a physical activity, and so I guess yoga is the classic example of training the body and the mind together, and because it has that deep spiritual and wisdom dimension to it, it clearly speaks to some of the fundamentals of wisdom.
And maybe also we can think about the Bhagavad Gita, one of the most also famous export
yes.
of India, and how the setting and the beginning of the teaching by Lord Krishna to Arjuna is a battlefield. So in the midst and thick of the fury, of a battle which is to come. And and the question of Arjuna is, what do I do with that? What choice do I make? And do I fight? Means, how do I act now in this world where there seems to be so much conflict? Yeah.
That's a really good link into my next point about what's important about the Indian tradition, and that is that I think it's very strong in asking metaphysical questions. So by that I mean metaphysics really refers to asking fundamental questions about the nature of reality, or fundamental questions about human nature. But it also has an implication of being in the midst, right? So in the midst of everything that's going on, how do you understand really fundamental things about life, really fundamental things about what you ought to do, how you ought to do them, what kind of outcomes should you be seeking? So I found this particularly in Buddhism, but I've seen it also in other Vedic traditions as well. There's this very strong dimension where we're trying to come to grips with what's fundamental about reality, and developing that very clear way of thinking about, well, what really matters. And what I like about it is that, or another thing that I like about it is that that then feeds back into how you behave and how you act as a member of society as well. And so practical wisdom also requires this connection to what is really fundamental. And, we can talk about the idea that all things are connected, that there's this common collective consciousness that grounds us all and makes us all understand each other as fellow humans and so on, and how that's really important for empathetic and ethical and behaving kindly in society. And I think there's this very strong tradition in India of a kind of pluralism and being very accepting. I mean, I know it's not perfect and there are issues at the moment, but I think that's a really important thing, and we need, as individuals, if we want to become wiser, we've got to figure out how we really are connected to this greater thing. And the classic story of Indra's web in the Vedic literature is kind of fundamental to that sense that everything is connected, and that and the idea of karma, that and whether you believe in reincarnation or not, it doesn't really matter at one level, because karma is just saying that what you do now has impacts for other people in the future. And so there's a sense that
across time and space, absolutely.
You've got to always be paying forward. And I think that's just a really, really important and practical idea, given the shape of the world, with war in Ukraine and tension growing in the South China Sea, and climate change. There's just so many issues that have built up because we haven't really thought about the welfare of those who come after us in the future. So, so I think those are really important things that I find in the Indian literature. And I guess my point really here is that there's kind of a balance. So if you get that Eastern and Western wisdom traditions and bring them together, the bits that the Westerners are good at and the bits that the Easterners are good at are often just slightly different, but they complement.
Absolutely. So what would be your thoughts or your suggestion about bringing these two universes together? How do you initiate and begin to have a dialogue which takes place between one side, the yogi or the mystic or whatever you call it, or the Jivan Mukta or the Karma Yogi on one side, and the other side, this research space? How do you make them talk to each other?
Well, it's up to us. What we're doing right now is part of the solution, I guess. And just trying to get the conversation happening and being part of the conversation. And I guess in the context of, professional researchers trying to get their research published in scholarly journals, there's a tendency for people to be very risk averse and not do controversial things, or not do things that are not completely standard. And so getting past that and having a little bit of intellectual courage and saying, look, I'm going to try and get some of these ideas and these these strange Sanskrit words published in the scholarly literature.
And these parables and these allegories and imageries, and also deep metaphysical, as you said, also reflection on reality, the nature of reality. Yeah, absolutely. So that could be a little bit disturbing this stable and quiet universe of research and publication, where something alien is coming, something which is unfamiliar to the people who have not been trained in philosophies, in these philosophical systems. So it's not an easy task, in fact, David. Yeah.
Oh, no, it's a very, very difficult task. And, some of those ancient ideas are actually almost impossible to explain to a Western audience. So if I take the Buddhist idea of non-self as an example, it's almost impossible for Western people, because they come from such an individualistic tradition, and we're all trying to find our true selves. And then the Buddha comes along and says, well, guess what, everybody? There's no true self. and that gives a lot of people in the West a sense of them having their persona annihilated, because they're saying, well, I am a self, and here I am, and you're over there, and I'm an individual. But in fact, it doesn't mean that you don't exist and that you're not an individual. It just means that you don't have this enduring self that exists right through your life in an unchanging way. It just means that who you are is subject to change all the time. And
absolutely. And in fact, if you allow me, this neuroscience now is has when somebody who is familiar with neuroscience and who is looking at concept of consciousness or the sense of I from the neuroscience point of view, will be quite comfortable with these ideas that Buddhism and also Vedanta is speaking about, that there is no tangible, let's say, unit which is there and a fixed entity which is there, because it's always in flux and always changing. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So, it's a big task, but look, a lot of people all around the world are doing yoga, and they're doing mindfulness meditation. So, there are more people in the West who are at least curious about it than you might think.
Sure.
And quite a lot of people. So people, I hang out with, a lot of them do understand this stuff, at least at some level. And, if I'm teaching corporate social responsibility to students, one of the things that particularly undergraduates will come and ask me is, I want to make some contribution to making the world a better place, but it seems too overwhelming, and I'm only one tiny little person, and no one really cares what I say. And my answer to that is the same every time. Look, figure out what you can do and just focus on that. Don't worry about whether it's too big or too small. Just do that, and just get into the conversation with people about the things that matter and the things that you think need to change. And the more you do that, then the chances are that someone else that you talk to will go, oh yeah, I'm going to talk about that too. And then over time, you just eventually get to a critical mass, and it doesn't need to be a grand gesture. We're lucky, we have the resources that we can have a podcast, and we can have a center in a top Indian business school, and so we can get access to audiences in a more efficient way than your average undergraduate. But still, it's just us doing what we know we can do given the resources we have. and just having the courage of conviction to get out there and talk about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, this leads us to the other side, which is, since we are both, let's say, also teaching in business schools and meeting a lot of executives and CEOs and so on, and leaders, then what is the perception, or what is, do you think, the main challenge, or is there any challenge for this corporate, let's say, world to, let's say, import, assimilate, integrate in their leadership intervention some of these ideas coming from, again, slightly alien, let's say, kind of universe where it's still associated, even in India, when you speak about Bhagavad Gita and Indian philosophy, they tell you, yeah, I will see that when I will get retired. Now is not the time to do all this and think about all these deep ideas. It's not practical at all. So there seems to be some well-ingrained ideas even in India. And you will be surprised maybe to hear that. Well, I'm sure you have discussed with some of them. So what that could help us here bring that together? I know mindfulness and yoga, as you said, have already opened the door to some extent. So what is it that can be done? Yeah.
I think the answer to that is pain. So the corporate world, the more pain the corporate world is experiencing because it's struggling to cope with complexities of global climate change, global conflict, global poverty, changes in the geopolitical arrangement, the more pain they suffer in struggling with those massive problems, I think the more motivated they are to look for new things. And I think I see that happening. So some people in the corporate world will say, well, you know, like, this David Rooney guy, he's just a weirdo, and you know, he's
it
just
sounds familiar.
Yeah, he's just a hippie who smuggled himself into a business school, and okay, yeah, maybe I am, you know, but look, the bottom line here, I think, and what I would say to people in the corporate world, or leaders anywhere, or people anywhere that are facing major problems where they have to make decisions and take action, is, wouldn't you rather have something on your side that helps you make really good decisions in really difficult situations? And the bottom line is, that's what wisdom is for. That's why we've been talking about it for thousands and thousands of years. And that's why there's been a kind of, you know, an evolutionary developed capacity in humans to do wise things. Maybe no individual does wise things consistently all the time, or only very rare individuals, but we can all be wise sometime. And so it's probably really just a basic survival capability. So yeah, but I would say at the moment, what I see here in Australia is that people in industry are starting to move in this sorts of directions, and we know corporate mindfulness programs have popped up everywhere, and yoga in the workplace is actually a pretty old thing now.
Sure.
So you see things are shifting, and we know that more and more people are in the West are becoming interested in non-religious spirituality. So there is that sense, you know, we were talking about this common or collective consciousness that we're all part of, you know, this web, and, you know, we have to pay forward. And so more and more people want that. They want to have that feeling. They want to feel connected to the past, to the present and the future. And, you know, because it's all connected to the meaninglessness that people feel about life and the loneliness that they feel. And so people are beginning to push back, and some parts of the corporate world are doing that and some parts are not. But eventually things just have to change. You know, I mean, absolutely. Here in Australia, the impacts of climate change are already quite devastating.
So very true. In India also, when I speak with this young generation, they're absolutely, let's say, they are totally open to explore. Because they see that the standard way and the standard, let's say, theories or let's say systems with which we are used to conduct our affairs have their limits. I mean, then we have maybe to look at a version 2.0 or 3.0 of our system, right?
So, you know, but and as you say, generational change is a big issue.
Yeah, absolutely.
And young people are always more open, and I see it as well. You know, young people really, you know, they do have more of an sense of existential threat than we did, you know, when we were undergraduates or in high school. So
absolutely,
and rightly so, because, you know, like things are pretty messy at the moment. I'm not saying that we're beyond hope, because I don't think we are beyond hope, but we do need to act pretty decisively, quickly, and well.
David, imagine now I am, let's say, a senior executive in whatever industry you want to choose, and I am somebody who is open, and I would like really to develop myself. I realize that there is a journey here, and I have to develop myself on several, let's say, lines, cognitively, emotionally, maybe in terms of my action with the world and people and so on. So what could be, apart in addition to what we know, I mean, generally is known about mindfulness and yoga, what are some other practices that you see could really benefit me as a young executive?
Yeah, well, there are a couple of things that jump to mind straight away. One is coaching, and I know you're going to interview Dr. Elizabeth King, who is an executive coach. And so people might want to listen to that podcast as well and hear what she's got to say about coaching. Her PhD is in mindful leadership. So, you know, having a coach can be a really, really practical thing. It's and in our context, if we're talking about India, it's kind of like having your own teacher or guru. So that's a very, very practical thing, and it's not controversial at all, because executives quite readily take on a coach. Another thing, one of the things that I like to do with students, particularly undergraduate students, is to go through a process of thinking what my core values or what their core values are, and then thinking about, okay, so if these are my values, let's say generosity is my core value, what does that mean? Because values are very abstract, you know, generous, fair, kind, you know, whatever it happens to be. And people are generally speaking, in my experience, have very foggy ideas about what their core values are. But if we take those abstract values like generosity, we can say, well, what do I mean by that? Do I mean, am I generous with my money? Am I generous with my time? Am I generous with my words? What is that? What do you mean by that? And because obviously not everyone can be generous with their money, because not everyone's got enough money to be generous with it. And particularly students, you know. So what do we mean by that? And then we can say, well, what behaviours would honour that value?
Excellent.
And then what I get the students to do is, over a 4 or 6 week period, try to honour that value and keep a diary of every day, where they record in that diary how they how they succeeded and failed in honouring that value. And then at the end of that, they write a reflective piece which talks about, how did I go? What was I good at? What was I not good at? And psychologists would call that a behavioural experiment.
Yeah.
And part of it is, so to think about, what are values? How do they work? How do they translate into behaviour? And then can I practice bodily doing that behaviour? So if I've decided that I'm going to, vegetarianism is a core value, I'm not going to go to McDonald's on the way home from the movies on Friday night. Right? So I'm going to make my body not walk in underneath the golden arches of McDonald's. And so this is, again, gets back to that idea of practical wisdom as a way of living in society. And nice. It begins to develop the habit. So if we go back to Buddhism and to Aristotle, but also Plato and Socrates, they all saw that one of the fundamental things in wisdom development was just developing wise habits of mind and habits of body.
Yeah, I was thinking about something else, just to connect it also to the way in Greek philosophy also, but also in Indian philosophy, the way, for example, I have learned is to read the text and then think and reflect about the meaning of this text. And I know that one of our colleague and friend, Monica Ardel, for example, is making her student look into some philosophical ideas, but reading directly through the text and see how these concepts of, for example, coming from Stoicism, for example, on endurance, or on I am part of a whole, a cosmos, which is well ordered. How does this, as I'm reading this text now from the original philosopher, how does this matter now for my life, and how I can translate it into behavior, as you mentioned? Yeah. So that would be also.
I think that's a really great thing to do, and because we often think, what happened 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, how could it be relevant to a modern society with, nuclear power and computers and space rockets going to the moon and all of that sort of stuff. But, at the end of the day, they're still fellow humans going about human life in human societies. And in some ways, maybe there was less complexity to life back then that gives them much more clarity. So there's much less noise for them to see through, right, to understand what really, really matters. And so sometimes there's just a clarity in those ancient texts, which is really hard to get today. And often it's just the simple observations about reality, the clear, simple understandings that actually make the biggest difference. So, and also, I think it's important, it helps students to learn as well if they're hearing multiple voices. So we could read a modern text in Psychology of Wisdom, and then we can read an ancient text in wisdom philosophy. Then we might watch a movie which is a fictional portrayal of a character who has some sort of wisdom, and maybe we get someone to come in, a guest speaker to come into class and talk. So I think it helps students when they're getting multiple voices, because I think, as a teacher, you often feel like they get tired of hearing your voice.
Absolutely.
I certainly get tired of hearing my voice as well. So, I think it's good, and as you say, reading Stoic texts is really good, and it's actually become quite popular in many corporate cultures around the world, because it's very practical.
Absolutely.
I mean, the Stoics were very practical people, and again, they took seriously the idea that it's not just about having wise thoughts; it's about acting wisely in your life, and
excellent.
So it's a very good thing to do.
Yeah. So, David, any final thoughts that you would have on this relationship and this possible contribution of our, let's say, Indian kind of philosophy or let's say, mainstream that we are seeing as of now to the field of wisdom, both research and application? Any final thoughts?
Yeah. So, well, firstly, I'd say to anyone who's even remotely curious about Indian intellectual history to give it a shot, because it is really fascinating. And I think it's University College London has a philosophy podcast. It's called Philosophy Without Any Gaps, and there's a whole series on the history of Indian philosophy, and it's fabulous, and it's all
interesting
professional philosophers that do it. But it also covers Africa and the whole world, and it's a project to kind of try and capture the full history of global philosophy. So that's a good place to start, because you don't have to read anything. You can just put your earplugs in and listen to the podcast. And it's not a competition either. Say, oh well, Indian philosophy is better than Greek philosophy, because actually there's a lot of similarity in the pathways that they've gone along. And as I say, it's often that in one tradition or the other, they emphasize one thing more than the other. And by bringing them together, you get a more complete and balanced picture. So, so I would say keep track of these podcasts and other things that the centre is going to post. I think we'll do some research videos as well, and in the future, who knows, we might have conferences and workshops and all sorts of things. So keep up to date with all of that. It's important also to remember that the key people around the world who are actually the contemporary wisdom researchers are interested in this, and many of them are getting involved with us in the centre, because they also see that it's important to bring all of these traditions together. So it's not just you and I saying this; it's a whole bunch of people and a lot of them are people who really, really matter. So so take confidence in the fact that these people who've got better things to do with their time than waste it on some trivial philosophical pursuit. But actually they're saying, well, no, this isn't trivial. This is really important, and we really do need to know this stuff. And I'm excited that we've got so many of the best people in the world who've already given up their time to help us out. And
absolutely.
Look, it's just fascinating stuff. Like you'll never be bored if you get involved. And but if you also see it as an opportunity to make yourself just that little bit wiser than you otherwise would have been, then that's a positive for you. And it's a positive for all the people who are around you and who you impact on and influence. So, and it's fun, like it really is fun to learn this stuff. And it also, I think it has a real impact on how you feel that sense of connection more broadly across the globe, because you see that there's this tradition in India, there's this European tradition, And there are the relatively modern American philosophical traditions, but we're all struggling with the same dilemmas and problems of living, and we're all trying to reach inside and find meaning in life. We're all trying to find connection. We're all trying to stave off the cold, icy wind of loneliness. So, and this is a good way to do that. And I guess I've travelled a lot around the world and often on my own, and I'm in countries where I have no idea what people are talking about, and you can often feel really incredibly isolated and incredibly alone and incredibly excluded. And I thought about it from a wisdom perspective once, and I think I was actually in Taiwan.
Yes.
And in Taipei, and I could see people doing Tai Chi in the parks, and I felt just incredibly foreign, and suddenly it occurred to me, well, a wise thing to do would be, as I walk along the street, just smile. And I did, and you know what? People smile.
That changed the whole thing. Yeah.
Yeah, and all of a sudden, you know what? You don't feel like you're a complete foreigner. You don't feel like an alien anymore. And so, yeah, it's learning about wisdom can help you with that on those two levels, giving you practical things that you can do, but also just knowing that you're part of this larger mindset that has existed for thousands of years and that is just so fundamentally human.
Absolutely. So nice place to stop. Yeah, the beauty and the challenges of being a human, just a human, and how wisdom can help us live. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So thanks a lot, David, for this wonderful conversation. And
my pleasure, Surya.
So we'll catch up soon.
Okay. Bye-bye.
You were listening to Sapience, a special podcast series by SPJIMR Institute of Management and Research, Mumbai, brought to you by SPJIMR Center for Wisdom in Leadership, produced by Vinita Dwivedi and the communications team.